Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Thank you about giving me that little bit of breather last week. I really appreciate it and you guys were really supportive. Today we will be looking at Anne of Cleves. She was the fourth wife of King Henry VIII and often regarded as the ugly queen. But before we get into the video, make sure that you're subscribed if you haven't already, and if you do enjoy this video, make sure you give it a like. Just a little bit of a disclaimer before we get into it. I will try and use the same name. However, I did notice while writing this that I was flipping quite a lot between the Anglican names, like Anne, and their Germanic names, like Anna. So there'll be Anne, Anna, Johann, John. I've gone through the script and I've tried to keep it all Germanic, but if it does slip through, that'll be why. Anne, or Anna of Cleves, was born on the 28th of June 1515 to Maria and Duke Johann III of Cleves. She was their second daughter and child. Anne had one older sibling, Sybil or Sibylla, and Anne was named after her paternal aunt Anna, the only legitimate daughter of Duke Johann II. Anne's place of birth is disputed, but it is most likely that she was born in Dusseldorf. Anna and her sisters held the title of born Duchesses of Jülich-Klevesberg. In the Holy Roman Empire, which comprises of present-day parts of Germany, inheritance laws barred women from inheriting. In the absence of a male heir, the husband of the born duchess was entitled to rule the territory, Jur Uxoris. Now I just want to say with that last word before anyone comes at me with the pronunciation, I even googled that. Normally I just give a punt. I actually googled it and I still don't know how to say it because it was all done by robots. So if it's wrong, don't blame me. I did try to educate myself, okay? But basically what that means is the right of wife. And as we'll see, Anna's mother, Maria of Jülichberg, exemplifies this scenario. Maria, her father's sole legitimate offspring, had no brother to inherit. Maria's half-brother, Johann of Jülich, was illegitimate. In 1509, Maria married Johann of Clevesmark, and following her father's death in 1511, Johann assumes the title of the Duke of Jülichberg by right of wife. Anna was joined by a younger brother, Wilhelm, in 1516, and a final sibling and sister, Amalia, or Amelia, in 1517. It is likely that both of these younger siblings were born at the Swan Castle, but the traditional place of birth given for these two is often Dusseldorf. Anna, along with her sisters Sibylla and Amalia, received their upbringing within the Frauenzimmer, also known as the women's chamber at court. This enclave mirrored the main court, but strictly prohibited males over the age of 12, except for doctors, and entirely excluded males during the nighttime. The Frauenzimmer inhabitants comprised the principal noblewoman, so Maria, her female relatives and daughters, attendants, a governess, and wards. This institution was prevalent across Germany and even extended towards parts of Poland. Within the Frauenzimmer, young noblewomen received education on household management. Anna, for instance, acquired skills such as mending clothes, weaving, embroidering, and cooking, essential for overseeing a household. The Frauenzimmer enforced rules of conduct concerning interactions with men at court, including permissible court dance styles, appropriate moments for engaging with men, and expected moral comportment. Additionally, a hierarchical seating arrangement and dining protocol were adhered to during mealtimes. Rather frustratingly, more is documented about what Anna was not educated in rather than what she was taught, under the guidance of her deeply devout mother, Duchess Maria. Anne's education encompassed traditional skills befitting of high-born ladies, household management like I've already discussed, culinary arts, estate management, and literacy in their native tongue. However, Duchess Maria did not endorse the courtly education typical of princesses elsewhere in Europe, which included proficiency in foreign languages, music, dance, and courtly pastimes like card games, dice, and poetry. In Germany, it was deemed inappropriate for noblewomen to personally engage in musical performances. Anna probably acquired fundamental accounting abilities essential for maintaining precise records and managing a noble household effectively. As members of the Frauenzimmer, Anna and her sisters likely participated in hunting activities. Their upbringing, like their education, was supervised by their mother, who would have instilled in them the Catholic faith. And yes, I said Catholic faith. That was not a mistake. It wasn't until Anne's father invited the scholar Erasmus to live at court did the Protestant faith spread in Cleves. This may explain why Anna is so easily converted back to Catholicism under the reign of her stepdaughter Mary, or due to Mary's influence. Duke Johann, Anna of Cleves' father, displayed a higher level of tolerance towards religious diversity compared to many of his contemporaries. Although he adhered to Catholicism himself, he demonstrated openness to the increasing presence of Lutheranism within and around his duchies, and he was influenced by Erasmus. In 1533, Duke Johann sought advice from Erasmus regarding the establishment of church regulations, having rejected the authority of the Pope. He arranged a marriage for his eldest daughter, Sibylla, with Lutheran Johann Frederick of Saxony, who later spearheaded the Schmalkaldic League, a coalition of German states embracing the Lutheran Confession of Augsburg. Consequently, Anna and her siblings were raised as Catholics, but they were also exposed to Lutheranism. 1527 saw the wedding of Anna's older sibling, Sibylla, to Johann Frederick I, the Elector of Saxony. With the eldest Cleves daughter married off, the focus now moved to Anna, who was now 12. She found herself betrothed to the 8-year-old Francis, the son of the Duke of Lorraine, who also happened to be the brother of Marie de Guise. Nothing would come of this match, mainly because Francis was not of age for the marriage to be legal. A dispensation was given to allow both parties to marry. Another marriage for Anna would be discussed at this time. It will be a double match. Her brother Wilhelm would marry the Lady Mary of England, and Anna to the king himself, King Henry VIII. However, this was discussed and then partially abandoned. After the death of his third wife and queen, Jane Seymour, several women, including Christina of Denmark and Marie of Guise, were approached to be wife number 4. However, they rejected the king's advances, so much so that Marie went and hastily got married to Henry's nephew, James V of Scotland, just to get out of it. Okay, well, I'm sure that's not the only reason, but pretty much. Tensions with France and Spain meant that Henry ideally needed a foreign match, so he had some sort of support against his Catholic allies. Duke Johann of Cleves had traditionally been Catholic. However, in 1533, he had famously rejected the authority of the Pope and was now more Lutheran. He also had 2 unmarried daughters, which was just what Henry needed. In March 1539, King Henry VIII sent an embassy to Cleves to talk marriage terms between the king and either Anna or Amalia. The English ambassadors were well received in Dusseldorf. However, they were not received by Duke Johann. They were instead received by his son Wilhelm, as his father had died the month before. Christopher Mont, one of the ambassadors who was sent to Cleves, reported on the 18th of March 1539 that Anna was so beautiful that she outshone her sister Sibylla, Electress of Saxony, as the golden sun excelleth the silver moon, and that her honesty and modesty appear plainly in the gravity of her face, a far contrast from the description that another ambassador gave when the double marriage was on the cards, that there was no great praise of either Anna's personage or her beauty.
The cheek, the nerve, the gall, the audacity and the gumption.
Either way, the ladies Anna and Amalia were presented in conservative German fashion. They wore a habit that meant the ambassadors could hardly see their faces, and their clothing hid their figures. So Christopher Mont was either genuinely impressed with Anna, or he was being paid off by Thomas Cromwell to promote the alliance with Cleves. It would be because of Mont's account that Henry would send off his favourite painter, Hans Holbein, to paint the sisters.
Welcome to the house!
To the house of Holbein, yeah! The house of Holbein.
Only thing is, Wilhelm was not so keen on Holbein painting the portraits. No. He wanted his painter, Lucas Cranach, to paint the portraits. Wilhelm even expressed his concern about marrying one of his sisters to the infamous King of England. He claimed he was too poor to pay a dowry and expressed his concerns over the fate of Henry's previous wives. He felt that any woman marrying him would face uncertainty and sorrow. I mean, he's not wrong. And also, rather ironically, Mr. Too Poor to Pay a Dowry Wilhelm would be known as Wilhelm the Rich. Henry and Cromwell were informed of Wilhelm's objections to Holbein painting his sisters, so Henry decided he would have the Lady Anna's portrait painted, as it was rumoured that she was more beautiful than her sister Amalia, and if he liked Holbein's portrait, then he would take Anna to be his wife without a dowry. This was a very good offer, one that Wilhelm could not refuse. Dr. Wotton, one of Henry's envoys, said that he thought Holbein's painting was quite lifelike. Anna had a sweet and gentle demeanour, and her mother, Duchess Maria, adored her so much she hated to see her go. Anna was skilled with a needle, could read and write in her own language, and was pretty intelligent. But she couldn't converse in Henry in a common language, nor could she sing or play any instruments. Nicholas Wotton thought that Anna could pick up English quite fast. She only knew High Dutch, a language, as mentioned earlier, Henry didn't understand, and she came from a place where they didn't value music, something that Henry loved. It seems she wasn't familiar with dancing or fashion either. The marriage treaty was signed by the Duke of Cleves on the 4th of September 1539, and it was concluded at Hampton Court Palace on the 4th of October. The Lady Mary was concerned that her father was marrying a Lutheran heretic. Ironically, Anna and Mary would go on to be good friends with less than a year between them in age, and it would be Mary's influence that would cause Anna to convert back to Catholicism. Anna of Cleves reached Calais on the 11th of December 1539. She was greeted at Calais by the Seymour brothers, Edward and Thomas, the brothers of the late Queen Jane. Thomas Cromwell's son, Gregory, was also present. His ties lie with his father, who orchestrated this match, and his wife Elizabeth was the sister to the former Queen and the Seymour brothers. The King's lieutenant in Calais was Arthur Viscount Lisle, his half-uncle. His wife, Lady Lisle, wrote to her daughter Anne Bassett. Anne had previously served Jane and had now managed to grab a spot in the new Queen's household. Her mother, Lady Lisle, wrote to her telling her that she thought the new Queen was gracious, willing to be pleased by everything done for her, and was likely to be an easy mistress. Anna stayed in Calais longer than originally planned due to bad weather. Anna remained at Calais until Christmas Day, and while there, she struck up with a friendship with the Earl of Southampton, who taught her how to play one of King Henry VIII's favourite pastimes, cards. One evening, she invited some gents including Southampton, to supper. Southampton was cautious, as this was not the done thing for a betrothed woman to do, and he was worried about what the king might say. But Southampton was also too embarrassed to refuse Anna's invitation. All in all, it must have been a good time, as Southampton wrote that he found Anna's manner, usage, and semblance was such as none might be more commendable, nor more like a princess. Anna left Calais on Boxing Day and arrived in England on the 27th of December. Her next place to stay was Bishop's Palace, where she stayed during the New Year celebrations. Bishop's Palace was the home of Sir Anthony Browne. His wife, Lady Browne, was to supervise the Queen's new maids of honour, and when she was presented to Anna, she was not impressed with the new Queen. She wrote to her husband and told him that she thought Anna had a dreadful dress sense. It would also be here at Bishop's Palace that Anna, unknowingly, would meet her husband for the first time. It was chivalric tradition that you would meet your betrothed in disguise to symbolise that the match would be one of true love, as the idea is that the bride-to-be would recognise her true love through the disguise. A game that Henry played with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. However, Anna was not Catherine. While standing at a window watching some bull baiting, 3 men in hoods leapt into the room laughing. One of the men offered her a gift from the king. A rather confused Anna, who, remember, could really only converse in High Dutch, took the gift and returned to the window. The stranger spoke. Anna muttered something in her native tongue and turned away again. The hooded stranger was becoming increasingly frustrated. He soon left, I can only imagine in a huff, and when he returned, he was wearing a purple robe. It was at this point that Anna realised her faux pas, and that the weird stranger was her ageing husband. She gave a weak smile, but the damage was already done. Upon their first awkward encounter, Henry and Anna spent the afternoon together at Bishop's Palace, and they talked via an interpreter. The king welcomed Anna to England and initially showed no dislike. And yet, he was unhappy with his wife. Was it because he had to tirelessly talk to her through a translator? I mean, he pretty much executed his second wife because she talked too much. Was it the fact that she embarrassed him in his chivalric game in front of his friends and not provided the smothering of kisses as Catherine once had? Or did he genuinely find her unattractive? I don't know, but their pleasant afternoon turned to Henry complaining about his new wife. He felt that Anna looked different from her portraits. He had brought her a present of furs, but he was in such an agitated state that he never gave them to Anna. The king excused himself, and Sir Anthony Browne caught him in the corridor. The king furiously remarked, "I see nothing in this woman as men report of her, and I marvel that wise men would make such report as they have done." He then continued, "Whom shall men trust? I promise you I see no such thing as hath been shown me of her, by pictures and report. I am ashamed that men have praised her as they have done, and I love her not." Rather ironically, Henry had written in his book Defence of the Seven Sacraments against Martin Luther, that was written years prior, that the fate of princes to be in marriage of far worse sort than the condition of poor men. Princes take as is brought by others, and poor men be commonly at their own choice. When he had written this, he was married to Catherine of Aragon, most likely a love match, but definitely a queen he had chosen. His next 2 queens had been love matches, but now for the first time, he was experiencing the painful reality of his own words. So who was to blame? Arguably Holbein, as he had essentially airbrushed Anna. But Holbein was an artist, and Henry could understand his artistic viewpoint. So that just leaves Thomas Cromwell, the man who suggested this marriage, the man who arranged the marriage and had Anna's charms and beauty exaggerated. Henry confronted Cromwell, accusing him of deception in front of the Privy Council. Shocked, Cromwell attempted to deflect blame, but Henry remained resolute. Cromwell argued for the necessity of an alliance for England, emphasising that alienating the Germans would leave Henry isolated against the French and the Spanish. He insisted that Anna herself had committed no wrongdoing, and it would be dishonourable for the king to reject her at this stage. Sending her back disgraced would ruin her chances of marriage and would lead to retaliation from her brother. Henry was urged to marry Anna of Cleves and make the most of the situation. Enraged, Henry stormed out of the council chamber. Much to the king's displeasure, the wedding did go ahead, and the pair wed on the 6th of January 1540 at Greenwich Palace. Henry wore a gown of cloth of gold, embroidered with great flowers of silver and banded with black fur, a coat of crimson satin slashed and embroidered, and fastened with huge diamonds, and a rich collar of gold around his neck. Anna wore a gown of cloth of gold, embroidered with large flowers of great orient pearls. It was cut in the Dutch fashion, having a round skirt without a train. Her long hair hung loose to showcase her virginity, and she wore a coronet of gold set with precious stones. She also wore an expensive necklace with a matching belt around her waist. Her wedding ring was inscribed with her personal motto, "God send me and keep me well." Walking between the Count of Overstein and the Grand Master of Cleves, Anna maintained a composed demeanour, her expression both demure and serious. Accompanied by the lords, she entered the king's chamber, traversed through, and arrived in the gallery where Henry awaited her. There she performed 3 deep obeisances before they proceeded to the Chapel Royal for their marriage ceremony, officiated by Cranmer. Anna was escorted by the Count of Overstein. Following the mass, the bridal party enjoyed spiced wine. Henry retired to his privy chamber to change into a gown of tissue lined with embroidered crimson velvet, while Anna accompanied her ladies to her chamber. Henry let it be known that "I will never have any more children for the comfort of the realm." Soon enough, the entire court was chuckling behind closed doors at the absurdity of the royal match. Luckily, the new queen couldn't speak much English and was unaware that she was being made fun of. Anna of Cleves deserves credit for gracefully adjusting to her new role. Many admired her courage, common sense, and dignified demeanour. Even the common folk were impressed by what they observed and heard about her. I want you to imagine that you've come over from a foreign country to a place where you don't speak the language, and it's your wedding day. One of the most magical days in a woman's life, and your groom is a man you've only met a handful of times. But he is the King of England, which means you will be England's new queen. It sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? With equal amounts of uncertainty and fantasy. That feeling you have is probably how Anna of Cleves felt on her wedding day. Except, this wasn't a fairy tale. This was real life. It's the 7th of January 1540, the morning after King Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves' wedding day. Most couples would be enjoying their first day of wedded bliss, and Anne should be enjoying being able to fully embrace her new role as the Queen of England. Well, this is not how this story goes. Henry did not hold back his displeasure for his new wife, telling Thomas Cromwell how he found Anne even more abhorrent than when he first met her. "I liked her before not well, but now I like her much worse." Henry went on to claim, "She is nothing fair and have very evil smells about her." Also, despite him claiming he did not like her when they first met, there is no real evidence to suggest that Henry disliked his wife. If you need a reminder of their encounter, watch part 1. He did, however, seem very stung about Anne's faux pas during his chivalric games. He also confided to a manservant that his bride was indisposed to excite and provoke any lust in him, and he could never be stirred to know her carnally. So basically, they were unable to consummate their marriage and legalise their union, and he left her as good a maid as I found her. As much as Henry wants to blame this on Anne, and him being repulsed by her appearance, let's be real, she wasn't the real reason the marriage wasn't consummated.
True. It's all true.
Tracy Borman suggests that it is at least equally possible that he was impotent. He was nearly twice his young bride's age and had become increasingly immobile in his recent years. There had been no talk of a mistress for some time. Obviously, this was not information that any man would want to be made public, let alone the king. Kings prided themselves on their sexual potency. Why do you think their codpieces take centre stage in their portraits? Victoria Bartels talks about the use of codpieces and their link to masculinity in Europe in her article on the University of Cambridge website. Quote, "Masculinity was big in 16th century Europe, along with notions of chivalry, honour and romance. Codpieces were speedily hijacked for the purpose of proving masculinity in the most blatant manners. The most elaborate versions were singularly showy, and portraits show that in the mid-16th century, the codpiece reached epic proportions." Henry also boasted to his doctor, Dr. Butts, that although he could not bring himself to have sex with Anne, he did have 2 wet dreams.
Whoop-de-doo!
Okay, so that's how Henry feels about the match, but what about Anne? Well, for her part, she seemed to have enjoyed married life. However, we will never know what happened behind closed doors, and don't forget, Anne may very well have been playing her role. It is often asserted that when the marriage was in its early days, Anne confided to her senior attendants, which included Lady Rochford, Lady Edgecombe, and Lady Rutland, that she believed she might be pregnant, telling them, "When he comes to bed, he kisses me, and taketh me by the hand, and biddeth me good night, sweetheart, and in the morning kisses me, and biddeth me farewell, darling." After some awkward glances, they wished that the Queen was with child soon, to which Anne informed them that she knew she was with child. Lady Edgecombe cautiously said, "I think your Grace is a maid still," to which Anne supposedly laughed and said, "How can I be a maid and sleep every night with the king? Is this not enough?" To which Lady Rutland is supposed to have retorted, "Madam, there must be more than this, or it be long ere we have a Duke of York." And then they apparently enlightened her on what was needed for conception. However, I don't know how much of this I actually believe, and I don't think that Anne was this naive or misinformed in how baby making was made, as she spent her childhood growing up in the Frauenzimmer, where she and her sisters would have been surrounded by pregnant women who had had children, and potentially even exposed to childbirth. Although I do find believable that maybe they didn't go into detail about conception, which may explain for her misunderstanding, there were midwives present within the Frauenzimmer. So given that she was in this environment, there is no reason to think that she did not understand the purpose of a noble marriage and how to produce children. Could this be propaganda made to help ruin Anne's credibility, to help make the annulment easier? A tournament was held on the 11th of January in honour of the new marriage, and Anne, rather quickly, dropped her German fashion. This would be the first time that she appeared in public in an English gown with a French hood, and yet, despite the public's approval of her new dress sense, it failed to have any effect on her husband. This was still prevalent 3 days later when Cromwell informed the council that the royal couple had not yet consummated their marriage, as the king liked not her body and could not be provoked or stirred to that act, though able to do the act with other than her. Anne may not have won over the king, but the same could not be said about his daughters. The 6-year-old Lady Elizabeth wrote from Hertford Castle, requesting to come to court as she was eager to meet her new stepmother. Permit me to show by this billet the zeal with which I devote my respect to you as Queen, and my entire obedience to you as my mother. I am too young and feeble to have power to do more than felicitate you with all my heart in this commencement of your marriage. I hope that your Majesty will have as much goodwill for me as I have zeal for your service." Anne was touched by Elizabeth's sentiment and asked her husband if his youngest daughter could come to court. However, Henry would not hear of it, and their relationship was not strong enough for Anne to have any influence. Henry took the letter and gave it to Cromwell. He then, rather harshly, ordered Cromwell to tell Elizabeth that she had a mother so different from this woman that she ought not to wish to see her.
Gonna need a sensu for that one.
By the end of January, Henry had dismissed most of Anne's German attendants and sent them back to Cleves, and plans had been made for a February coronation for Anne, with the traditional state entry into London to take place at the end of January. However, Henry had abandoned these plans without telling his poor wife why. Instead, a civil reception took place.
This is awkward.
By March of 1540, Henry and Anne still hadn't consummated the marriage, and now he was looking for a way out like he had with Catherine of Aragon. Interestingly enough, the first mention of Henry's courtship of Catherine Howard is a month later in the April, so he may have already clocked her and interacted with her in the March, when he's wanting an annulment.
Coincidence? I think not!
Henry claims that he could not consummate his marriage as he felt he wasn't entitled to do so because of the previous arrangement Anne had with the Duke of Lorraine's son. The council agreed that the marriage not being consummated was enough alone for an annulment, without having to drag up the pre-contract. In May 1540, the King and Queen appeared at jousts and banquets that were held to celebrate the May Day holiday. However, much to the concern of Thomas Cromwell, Henry continued to complain about Anne, saying she was waxed, wilful and stubborn with him, and it appeared that the couple were no better acquainted than before. In Anne's defence, she could have had anxiety or felt neglected by her husband, which may have explained her demeanour towards him. Cromwell warned Anne to not antagonise the king. Anne was not aware that she had offended the king. On the 10th of June 1540, Thomas Cromwell entered the council chambers, but before he could sit down, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, arrested Cromwell in the name of the king. A bill of attainder was drawn up against him and given to Parliament, with the charges of both treason and heresy. Cromwell was transported by barge to the Tower of London. 9 days later, the bill of attainder received the approval of the Upper House and was sent down to the House of Commons. Henry's ducks were slowly getting themselves in a row. He had found a replacement queen who he found attractive. He has a solid reason to annul the marriage. He's about to get justice against the man who arranged this disastrous fourth marriage. And now, he just had to do something about his unwanted queen. On the 24th of June, Henry sent Anne to the Palace of Richmond. His excuse was because there was plague in London, and he told Anne that he would join her in the country air in 2 days. Yeah, he didn't. The French ambassador, Charles de Marillac, heard talk of love and a new affection for another lady. While Anne was out of the picture, Henry would openly travel to visit his new lady, Catherine Howard, at Lambeth Palace, and they would dine at Bishop Gardiner's palace in Southwark. On the 3rd of July, Cromwell realised that he was in trouble and sent Henry a letter pleading for his life, which ended with, "Most gracious Prince, I cry for mercy, mercy, mercy," but his pleas fell on deaf ears. A few days later, the Privy Council made its way to Richmond Palace to see the Queen and asked for her consent for the idea of an annulment. Henry had decided to make generous financial provisions for Anne to increase his chances of her cooperating, which would ultimately make his life easier. Part of this provision included Richmond Palace, Bletchingley Manor, Hever Castle, £4,000 per year, or £1,685,428.80 in 2017 money. She was also allowed to keep her royal jewels, plate and goods in order to furnish her new properties. Henry assured the clergy that was appointed to investigate his marriage in a written declaration that he had no ulterior motive in seeking a divorce.
Right.
Yeah, okay. He claims that when the marriage had been proposed, he was in favour, because I heard so much both of her excellent beauty and virtuous behaviour. But when he met her, he liked her so ill that I was woe that ever she came into England, and deliberated with myself that, if it were possible to find some means to break off, I would never enter yoke with her. King Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves' marriage was declared to be null and void by Parliament on the 9th of July, 1540. Members of the Privy Council informs the now ex-Queen of England at Richmond Palace of the annulment of her marriage, and that she was to now refer to herself as the King's sister, an honorary title that the King had given to her as thanks for her cooperation in the annulment. The world also knew that Anne was still a virgin, so, if she wished to remarry, Henry had actually made it easy for her, which was actually quite considerate of him. It is often asserted that Anne fainted at the news. She didn't, but she must have felt some sort of considerable relief, knowing that she was not to follow the same fate as her predecessor Anne Boleyn. Dr. Wotton was sent to Cleves on the order of the King to inform Anne's brother Wilhelm. Anne had also told Dr. Wotton to inform her brother that she would be remaining in England, as she liked England, and probably the freedom it offered compared to Cleves. Wilhelm took the news fairly okay, commenting he was glad his sister had fared no worse. However, he was concerned that Anne might be persecuted for her faith if she stayed in England. She wouldn't be, but I think it's cute that her brother cares. King Francis I and Emperor Charles V also approved of the annulment. Funny that, seeing as the whole point of the marriage, or maybe better worded alliance, was to provide England with an ally against France and Spain. The Privy Council requested that the Lady Anne wrote a letter to the King, formally acknowledging the annulment of their marriage, which she did on the 11th of July. In the letter she accepted and approved the decision of the clergy, that your highness will take me for your sister, for the which I most humbly thank you accordingly. And she signed the letter, Your Majesty's humble sister and servant, Anne, the daughter of Cleves. Her rank as the king's sister now meant that she took precedence over all of the ladies of the kingdom, with a few exceptions, such as Henry's next wife and queen, and the king's daughters. She would also always have a place reserved for her at court. The marriage was formally annulled by a specially introduced Act of Parliament on the 12th of July 1540. 17th of July 1540, just days after Anne's marriage to the king had been annulled, Sir Thomas Wriothesley arrives at Richmond to formally disband the former Queen's household. Anne was appointed new officers and ladies. That included Catherine Bassett, the sister of Anne Bassett and daughter of Lady Lisle. Some people, however, remained in her service, such as her interpreter, Wymond Carew, and Martha Denny, who was previously in her household. Anne told Wriothesley that she would not favour her homeland of Cleves or her family over the king, and promised to let Henry see any of her letters that arrived from abroad, if he so wished, as proof of her loyalty to her ex-husband. Anne never missed an opportunity to prove to Henry that she was okay with the new situation. She appeared cheerful and wore new English-style dresses every day. Anne also found a new love of English food. There is no place like this England for feeding right well. Her banquets at Richmond became well known, and she often played hostess to guests from the court. When she wasn't hosting banquets, she was doing sports and recreation. Henry had a history of getting rid of those he no longer trusted, so this was a good way for Anne to keep her head down and to butter up the king, to make a request. Anne wrote to Henry asking permission to invite the Lady Elizabeth to visit her on occasion, saying that to have had her for a daughter would have been greater happiness to her than being queen. Henry granted the request, presumably as thanks for Anne's cooperation in the annulment of their marriage. Anne was charmed by Elizabeth's beauty and wit, and as a woman who had no desire to remarry, she channeled her maternal love and feelings onto her stepchildren, most notably the Lady Elizabeth, who she was very fond of. Elizabeth was much younger than Anne, unlike the Lady Mary, and she was never fussed over by a horde of governesses and nurses like Prince Edward. If Anne had any hopes of reconciling or getting her marriage back on track, they were swiftly dashed on the 28th of July, 1540, when King Henry VIII wed for a 5th time to Anne's former lady-in-waiting, Catherine Howard. The same day that Thomas Cromwell, the man who had arranged Anne's marriage, was executed. Apart from Anne herself, it looked like Henry had done everything to distance himself from his previous marriage. On the 6th of August 1540, Henry, with a few attendants, rode to Richmond, where Anne was staying. The French ambassador Marillac wrote that they were on the best terms possible, and they supped so pleasantly together that some thought she was to be restored to her place. But this wasn't entirely true. The visit was mainly business, and to witness Anne sign a document that is thought to have been the deed of separation. In late October 1540, Anne of Cleves had become ill with an upset stomach, and as such, the Tudor rumour mill got to work, saying that the former queen was pregnant with the king's child. The king, upon hearing the news, ordered this to be investigated, to which it was found out to be nothing more than just a rumour. On the 3rd of January 1541, the new king and queen hosted New Year's celebrations at Hampton Court Palace. The Lady Mary had very little respect for her new stepmother, probably because Catherine was younger than Mary, and as such, their relationship was fairly strained. However, Anne of Cleves, now wielding her title as the king's sister, had a fairly good relationship with the king, the queen, and the Lady Mary, so she acted as a mediator between the two women. In fact, Anne's relationship with the king was so good that rumours swirled later that year, in early April, of Henry dumping Catherine and getting back with Anne, to the extent that Catherine sought reassurance from her husband. Not gonna lie, taking Henry's track record into account, he would probably be the last person that I was going to ask for reassurance. But anyway, Henry is said to have told Catherine that she had nothing to worry about.
You serious?
And that even if he had to choose another wife, he would not choose Anne. I mean, that bit was true. Anyway, Anne and Catherine danced the night away at Hampton Court, hours after Henry had gone to bed. And when Henry gave Catherine a ring and 2 small dogs as seasonal gifts, the Queen gave them to Lady Anne. And prior to the night at Hampton Court, Anne had sent the King and Queen 2 horses with violet velvet trappings. Early November saw the start of Catherine Howard's downfall, and with that, the rumour mill got going once again. And it was the same old rumour of the king taking back Anne as his queen. But this time, France was in favour of the match. That's because since their marriage, King Francis had allied himself with the German princes, in hopes that if Anne and Henry got remarried, Henry would be a great ally against the Spanish. The rumours went from remarrying to Anne's had a baby. Not any baby though, but the king's baby.
Big blowing sack of drama say what?
Henry was understandably furious that no one from Anne's household had given him a heads up about this scandal. But I'm also like, Henry, why don't you just do the maths? Furthermore, Henry, why don't you just do the biology? If you two haven't consummated the marriage, no baby.
Pretty obvious.
So how did this rumour come about? Not long after the arrest of Queen Catherine Howard, Anne of Cleves was noted to have fallen ill. Some say it was after hearing about the news of the Queen. Others believe it was not an ailment but more of a mental health issue. Either way, she was out of sorts. At this time, coincidentally, her favourite lady, Dorothy or Dorothea Wingfield, had just given birth to a new son, William. And I imagine that she might have brought the child to see Anne to help lift her spirits, which may have been a reason for the childbirth rumour. Elizabeth Bassett, who had replaced Dorothy while she was in labour/recovering, and Jane Ratesy were attending to Anne at the time. Alison Weir states in her book The 6 Wives of Henry VIII that on the 22nd of October, Henry VIII, while at the moor in Hertfordshire, was astonished to learn there was a rumour circulating that he had impregnated Lady Anne of Cleves while he had visited her in Richmond in August. Henry was relieved to discover, after investigation, that Anne had been confined to her bed for only an upset stomach. Someone had suggested, and rumour had it, that it was morning sickness. Her Lady Jane must have mistaken Anne's sickness as morning sickness, as she was overheard saying, "It's God's working in his own way to make Milady Anne queen again." Anne was mortified at what her lady had just said, and firmly reprimanded Jane for her false statement, fully aware of the consequences. Anne's lady, Jane Ratesy, Elizabeth Bassett, and Dorothy Wingfield were closely questioned about the rumours. Now I just want to note that the sources I've used both mention that Jane was questioned, but one mentions Elizabeth and not Dorothy, and vice versa. So I just wanted to highlight that for clarity. Either way, Anne's ladies denied the rumours, and Henry was relieved, although he may not have been if he knew that both Jane and Dorothy were hoping that the downfall of Catherine Howard meant that their Lady Anne would be reinstated as queen. And they weren't the only ones. The Cleveland ambassador, Olislega, was also pushing for both Thomas Cranmer and the Earl of Southampton to try and influence the king to take Anne back as his queen. Even the French ambassador was asked to promote Anne's cause, but he wisely responded that it might be better to wait until Catherine Howard's fate had been determined before taking any action on Anne's behalf. Question is, was the Cleveland ambassador pushing for the reunion? Was he acting on the behalf of Anne herself? Or on the behalf of Anne's brother Wilhelm? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Marillac did not believe that the request came from Anne. He was more in the camp of the Cleveland ambassador. In early December of that year, the council wrote to Sir Anthony Browne, although the handwriting is thought to be that of Thomas Wriothesley. We examined also, partially before dinner and partially after, a new matter, that the Lady Anne of Cleves should be delivered of a fair boy, and whose it should be, but the King's Majesty, and gotten when she was at Hampton Court, which is most abnominal slander, and for this time and the case in as we think, most necessary to be met with all. This matter was told to Taverner of the Signet more than a fortnight ago, both by his mother-in-law, Lambert's wife, the goldsmith, and by Taverne's own wife, who says she heard it from Lilgrave's wife, and Lambert's wife also heard it from old Lady Carew. Taverner kept it, and they, with others, have made it a common matter of talk, and never revealed it till Sunday night, at which time he told it to Dr. Cox, to be further declared, if he thought good, who immediately disclosed it to me, the Lord Privy Seal. We have committed Taverner to the custody of me, the Bishop of Winchester, and Lambert's wife, who seems to have been a dunce in it, the Chancellor of Augmentatius. Just a day later, we discovered that Francis Lilgrave had indeed openly slandered Lady Anne, and spreading a rumour that she had had the king's baby son privately at one of her country houses. However, she couldn't, or wouldn't, name her sources. As a result, she was sent to the Tower of London along with Richard Taverner on the same charges. It appears Francis Lilgrave was a member of Anne's household, along with Jane Ratesy and Elizabeth Bassett. Question is, was there any substance to this, or was it just typical court gossip amongst the women? Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife and queen, was beheaded on the 13th of February 1542. Upon hearing the news of Catherine's fate, the Duke of Cleves hoped Henry would take back his sister. In the spring of 1542, he instructed his ambassadors to use their influence to promote a reconciliation. One German envoy visited Cranmer at Lambeth and directly asked him to facilitate this. When the king heard this from his archbishop, he instructed Cranmer to firmly inform the Duke of Cleves that there could never be a reconciliation between Anne and himself. That May saw a rumour of the failing health of Prince Edward. He was fine, but that didn't stop Parliament from trying to arrange another marriage for the king to produce the necessary spare. It was undeniable that there was a significant lack of suitable candidates for the vacant consort's throne. Most ladies viewed queenship as dangerously unstable, given the king's tendencies to either dismiss or execute his wives. He either putteth away or killeth his wives. It was generally agreed that any woman he married would need nerves of steel, sharp wits, and unquestionable virtue. Chapuis was of the view that Henry would choose his next wife, as, when he takes a fancy for a person or a thing, he goes the whole way. Enter Catherine Parr.
Hello there.
A woman who undeniably had nerves of steel, sharp wits, and unquestionable virtue. Any hope that Anne had of remarrying Henry evaporated on the 12th of July, 1543, when he wed for the final time to Catherine Parr at the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court Palace. Henry visited Anne at Richmond, and he informs the former queen himself that he had married Catherine Parr. Multiple sources say that Anne did not take this very well. Allegedly, pretty devastating and humiliating, especially as she thought that she was better looking than Catherine, a statement which none of the ambassadors who reported it denied. However, Alison Weir states quite the opposite. She showed not the slightest annoyance at her former husband uniting himself to another lady. Indeed, she seemed very pleased about it. A fine burden Madame Catherine has taken upon herself. This may have been after Anne had time to process the information. Chapuis reported that Anne was yearning to make a return to Cleves, as her mother, the Duchess Maria, was ill, and this news, that made certain that she would never remarry the king, must have been the last thing she wanted to hear. Anne's mother, Maria, died a month later. Okay, let's skip forward to the 28th of January 1547. At 2 o'clock in the morning, King Henry VIII yielded his spirit to Almighty God and departed this world, at the age of 55. Anne was informed of her ex-husband's death in early February. With Henry dead, Anne's stepson Edward assumes the throne as King Edward VI. The Lady Anne was now no longer the Queen's sister, and saw a decline in status. The new King's Privy Council saw Anne as a financial drain and an irrelevant relic from the previous king's reign. Anne would eventually have to give up 2 of the manors that Henry had given her. She established Hever Castle as a lively social centre where she regularly entertained. In March, rumours started about Anne potentially marrying the king's uncle, Thomas Seymour. Seymour bribed royal servant John Fowler to find out how Edward might take the news that he had proposed to Catherine Parr. When Fowler mentions that he was surprised that Thomas Seymour, the Lord Admiral, was not yet married, and if the king was happy for his uncle to marry, Edward responded with, "Yeah, very well." Fowler then asked, "Whom would your grace like him to marry?" Edward replied with, "My lady Anne of Cleves." Obviously, this was not the answer that Seymour and Fowler were looking for. However, Edward did also consider my sister Mary to turn her opinions. Thankfully, when Fowler asked the next evening if he should be contented to marry the Queen, the young boy king gave his approval. But this is another example of Catherine Parr being chosen over Anne on the marriage market. Although Catherine Parr would later die on the 7th of September 1548, and the idea of Thomas and Anne marrying did not resurface after her death, so I don't think either party was particularly keen. In 1548, Anne had to give Richmond Palace back to the Crown, as Edward's council did not pay Anne the allowance that Henry had set up for her, so she couldn't afford its upkeep. Anne did not uphold the maintenance of Richmond Palace, to the point that the council were shocked at the state she had left it in. Anne did not see it as her responsibility to maintain her properties. 2 years later, the Crown owed her so much money, she petitioned to her stepson, the King. Edward did get some of the money paid back to her, but she would never receive a full repayment. In 1552, Anne of Cleves once again complained and was granted various lands and manors to supplement her income. However, as she pointed out in a letter to her close friend, the Lady Mary, I was well contented to have continued without exchange, and had travailed to my great cost and charge almost this 12 months to that end. Anne of Cleves divided her time between Bletchingley in Surrey, Richmond Palace, prior to her handing it back to the crown, and Hever Castle. Anne was always welcomed at court, allowing her to enjoy the best of both worlds as an honorary member of the king's family and as a country gentlewoman. Thus, she witnessed the shifting tides of power and the changing fortunes of the monarchy during the mid-16th century. She saw Edward VI decline in health and learned of his death from consumption at 15 in July 1553. Shortly after, she heard of Northumberland's plot to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. With sincere gladness, she learned how the country rallied to Mary Tudor's cause, leading to Mary's overthrow of Queen Jane and her own proclamation as Queen of England. During Queen Mary I's coronation in 1553, Anne and Elizabeth were accorded the place of honour at Mary's lavish coronation. The two women shared an open chariot directly behind the Queen, which was draped in a cloth of silver. Anne and her youngest stepdaughter were also given new dresses. They were both robed in crimson velvet, and in the procession to Westminster Abbey, they walked together directly behind the new Queen. The next day, Anne dined at Mary's table, following the coronation itself, again alongside Elizabeth. Even Mary's cousin, Lady Lennox, whom the Queen was particularly fond of, was not given this honour. During Edward's reign, a Protestant form of religion had become mandatory. While Mary had always refused to conform, there is no evidence that Anne did anything other than obey the law. Now, with Mary restoring the country to Catholicism, Anne conformed once again. There is no information about her personal religious views. She likely had a preference, but no desire to be a martyr. Her mother had been a conservative Catholic, but her sister Sybil was considered a leading light in the Lutheran world. Soon after Mary's ascension, Anne requested that the government recognise her marriage to Henry VIII as valid. If granted, this would trigger the terms of the original marriage treaty, enabling her to return home with the status and wealth of a dowager queen. However, the annulment settlement specifically precluded her from going home. Discussions about Queen Mary finding a husband began. Anne felt confident enough in her relationship with Mary to join those advising the Queen about her marriage. Her preferred candidate, recommended by her brother, was Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, brother of Wilhelm's wife and son of Mary's cousin, the King of the Romans. However, Mary's engagement to her cousin Philip led to the Wyatt Rebellion in early 1554, which aimed to stop the marriage and potentially replace Mary with her half-sister Elizabeth, intending for Elizabeth to then marry Edward Courtenay. Mary believed that Anne was working against her. It is unlikely that Anne would have plotted against Mary in favour of Elizabeth for personal reasons, as there is no evidence of a quarrel between the two women. Reynard's suggestion that Anne sought revenge for her rejection by King Henry VIII also seems quite far-fetched, as neither Mary nor Elizabeth was responsible for it. A more plausible motive would be a general desire from Cleves to undermine the emperor, which Anne might have supported out of loyalty to her brother. There is no evidence that Anne was questioned about the rebellion. On the 3rd of April 1554, following Wyatt's defeat, Wilhelm sent a polite message of congratulations to Mary. Anne would receive devastating news later that spring of the deaths of her sister Sybil and her brother-in-law Johann Frederick. Out of her core family, only her, Wilhelm, and Amelia were left. It also seems that Anne had lost the Queen's friendship. Dissatisfaction over Anne's possible implication in the Wyatt Rebellion may have discouraged the Queen from reopening the question of the validity of Anne and Henry's marriage. When the Queen and her cousin Philip wed on the 25th of July 1554, Anne wrote from Hever to congratulate her stepdaughter on the marriage and ask, "When and where I shall wait on your Majesty and his." She had not been invited to the wedding, possibly because Mary still had a lingering suspicion of her stepmother. Despite asking for permission to visit the Queen and her new husband, there is no evidence that Mary invited Anne to court again. Anne wished that the couple should both enjoy much joy and felicity, with increase of children to God's glory and the preservation of your prosperous estates. By the 1550s, Anne of Cleves had converted to Catholicism, influenced by Queen Mary I. During the Inquisition in England, Anne rarely appeared at court, preferring the life of a private gentlewoman, attending to the domestic affairs and managing her estates. The rents from her estates allowed her to live comfortably, and her steward, Sir Thomas Cordon, formerly Henry VIII's Master of Revels, assisted her so ably that she bequeathed him her manor of Bletchingley as a reward when she died. Anne never remarried or left England. With her parents deceased and her brother, a strict Protestant, disapproving of her conversion, returning to Cleves was out of the question. She had grown fond of England and its people, intending to die in her adoptive land. In her later years, when her health began to fail, Queen Mary allowed her to live at Chelsea Old Manor, where Catherine Parr had once lived with Lord Admiral Thomas Seymour. It was here at the Chelsea Old Manor, in mid-July 1557, that Anne dictated her will. She left a diamond ring to her brother and a ruby ring to his wife. Another diamond ring went to her sister, Lady Amelia, as well as to the Dowager Duchess of Suffolk, Catherine Willoughby. The Lady Elizabeth was to receive Anne's second best jewel, while her best jewel was bequeathed to the Queen. Knowing she was dying, Anne ended her will with the request that all beneficiaries pray for her soul and ensure that her body was buried according to the Queen's will and pleasure, and that she might receive the last rites of Holy Church according to the Catholic faith, wherein we end our life in this transitory world. On the 16th of July 1557, Anne of Cleves died at Chelsea. By the Queen's order, she was buried with great ceremony in Westminster Abbey on the 3rd of August 1557. Members of Anne's household carried her banners aloft and walked in the procession. At Charing Cross, the cortege was met by 100 more of Anne's servants, all bearing torches, who joined the throng of mourners. Her ladies, clad in black and mounted on horses, were also present, along with 12 bedesmen of Westminster and 8 heralds bearing white banners of arms, who surrounded the corpse. At the Abbey door, everyone dismounted, and the Bishop of London, along with the Abbot of Westminster, received the body, swinging incense over it. The chief officers of Anne's household then came forward, broke their staves of office, and cast them after the coffin. Jane Seymour's sister, Elizabeth, Marchioness of Winchester, was the chief mourner, and led the ladies in making their offerings afterward. Mary ordered that Anne's funeral be conducted with all the ceremony due to a woman of such a high rank. Anne was the last Queen Consort of England to be buried in a Catholic ceremony. And that's where I'm going to leave today's video. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Anne of Cleves, then make sure you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, have a wonderful day.